After 42 years of marriage, she returned to her father's forgotten farmhouse, only to discover her husband had spent decades secretly trying to steal it. After decades of lies, she divorced and returned to her countryside house. Then a Navy SEAL and dog changed everything. Margaret Lawson thought the hardest part of her life ended the day she signed the divorce papers. But when she returned to the quiet farmhouse in the Appalachian Mountains, strange headlights appeared on the ridge at night, and a retired Navy SEAL with his loyal German shepherd realized someone had been watching the land for years. Before the story begins, comment 1 or 0 and tell us where you're watching from. The pen felt heavier than Margaret Lawson expected. She held it for a moment longer than necessary, staring at the final line on the page while the late afternoon light from the courthouse window settled across the desk in quiet bands of gold. 42 years of marriage had ended in a signature no larger than the ones she had written on birthday cards and grocery receipts. Margaret Lawson. The letters were neat, steady. Her hand did not tremble. Across from her, the clerk gathered the paperwork with the calm efficiency of someone who had witnessed hundreds of endings just like this one. The man offered a polite nod, sliding the folder into a stack beside several others. "Everything's finalized, Mrs. Lawson." Margaret nodded once, slowly. She stood, smoothing the sleeve of her coat as though adjusting something invisible. For a moment, she wondered if she should feel something dramatic. Anger, grief, relief. But what came instead was quieter. Something like the feeling after a long storm, when the rain stops and the air goes still. Outside, the air smelled of cold stone and approaching autumn. Margaret walked down the courthouse steps into the small Charleston parking lot, where her old silver sedan waited beneath a fading maple tree. The leaves had already begun turning copper along the edges. She placed her suitcase in the trunk, paused for a moment, with her hand resting on the metal lid, then closed it gently. The road ahead stretched west, into the mountains. The drive took nearly 5 hours. By the time the interstate gave way to narrow highways, and those highways narrowed further into winding 2-lane roads, the daylight had begun softening into the pale lavender of evening. The Appalachian Mountains rose slowly around her, quiet and ancient, their slopes layered with forests that seemed to roll like waves toward the horizon. Margaret drove with both hands steady on the wheel. She had not been back to the farmhouse in nearly 20 years. For most of that time, Daniel had found reasons to postpone the trip. Too far. Too much work to fix. Nothing worth keeping out there. The land was useless, he used to say. Just an old house and a few forgotten acres nobody wanted. Margaret had believed him. Or at least she had stopped questioning him. The road eventually turned to gravel, the tires crunching softly beneath the car as the valley opened before her. The Lawson farmhouse appeared at the end of the long drive just as the sun slipped behind the ridgeline. It stood where it always had. A modest 2-story structure with white siding now faded to pale gray, its porch sagging slightly beneath the weight of years and weather. Tall grass swayed along the fence line, and the orchard her mother once cared for had grown wild with neglect. But the house was still standing, and something about it felt patient. Margaret parked beneath the old oak tree beside the driveway. The engine ticked quietly as it cooled, and for a moment she simply sat there, looking at the place where she had grown up. Fog drifted slowly through the valley below. The air smelled of damp earth and distant wood smoke. She stepped out of the car and closed the door softly, her boots pressing into the gravel as she walked toward the front gate. Halfway there, she stopped. The back pasture gate stood open. Margaret frowned slightly. She was certain she had locked it the last time she visited, years ago, when she came to settle her father's affairs. The memory was clear, closing the latch, hearing the metal click into place. Now the gate hung loosely against the fence post, swaying slightly in the breeze. She stood there a moment longer than she meant to, studying the fence line. Perhaps the latch had rusted. Perhaps a storm had blown it loose. Still, something about it felt wrong in a way she couldn't explain. Margaret shook the thought away and continued toward the porch. The wood creaked softly beneath her weight as she climbed the steps and reached into her coat pocket for the old brass key her father had given her years ago. The lock resisted at first, then turned with a reluctant metallic sigh. The door opened. The smell inside was exactly the same as she remembered: dust, pine wood, and the faint sweetness of old paper. Evening light filtered through the windows in narrow beams, illuminating furniture draped with sheets and the quiet shapes of a life paused long ago. Margaret stepped inside slowly. Her father's house, now hers. She set her suitcase near the staircase and moved through the rooms with careful steps, touching the back of a chair, the edge of a table, the familiar wooden banister worn smooth by decades of hands. The silence felt deep, but not empty. Outside, the fog thickened across the valley floor. Far above the farmhouse, beyond the line of pines that crowned the ridge, another house overlooked the land from a distance most people never noticed. A small cabin built of dark cedar logs. Inside, a man stood near the front window, his posture still and alert. Ethan Cole had learned long ago that quiet landscapes often hid the most important details. He watched the headlights of the unfamiliar sedan when it first appeared on the valley road nearly an hour earlier. He had watched it wind slowly through the trees and disappear near the Lawson property. Beside him, a large German shepherd sat perfectly still. Ranger's ears were forward. The dog's eyes remained fixed on the valley below. "You see her too," Ethan said quietly. Ranger's tail gave one slow movement against the floor. Ethan stepped outside onto the cabin porch. The evening air carried the scent of approaching frost and the distant sound of insects settling into the night. From this height, he could see the Lawson farmhouse clearly. A faint light now glowed from one of the windows. The woman had arrived. Ethan leaned against the railing, watching the valley in silence. Years in the Navy SEAL teams had carved certain habits too deeply into him to forget. Even in retirement, even in a quiet place like this, his mind still mapped terrain and movement without effort. That was when he noticed something else. A set of headlights appeared briefly along the distant ridge road. Not the main road that led into the valley, the old logging road. The lights paused, then slowly disappeared again behind the trees. Ethan's expression tightened slightly. Beside him, Ranger rose to his feet. The dog stared toward the ridge with intense focus, muscles tense beneath his thick coat. "What is it, boy?" Ethan murmured. Ranger didn't bark. He simply watched. Down in the valley, the lights inside the farmhouse dimmed as Margaret moved from one room to another, unaware that she was no longer alone in the quiet mountains. Above her, on the ridge, the dog continued to stare into the dark, and the house that had waited so many years for Margaret Lawson was about to reveal why. Ranger's ears twitched. The German shepherd shifted his weight forward, muscles tightening beneath his thick coat as he stared into the valley below. Ethan Cole had learned long ago to trust the quiet signals of a trained dog. Ranger did not react to every sound or movement. When he did, there was always a reason. Ethan followed the dog's gaze toward the Lawson farmhouse. The faint yellow glow from the kitchen window still shone through the evening fog. Everything looked calm from a distance. Still, Ranger remained focused, his posture rigid. "What is it?" Ethan asked quietly. Ranger took 2 slow steps toward the edge of the porch, nose lifted slightly into the air. Ethan scanned the ridge road again. Nothing moved now. The logging trail had fallen dark and silent. Whoever had driven past earlier was long gone. But Ranger was still watching. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the familiar tension that crept in when something didn't fit right. Even after leaving the SEAL teams 3 years earlier, the instincts never left him. Quiet places could still carry the shape of trouble. He exhaled slowly. "Let's take a walk." Ranger's tail lifted slightly. Within minutes, Ethan had pulled on his worn field jacket and stepped off the porch. The trail that ran down the ridge was narrow and familiar. He walked it most mornings with Ranger before sunrise, when the valley was quiet and the mist lay low across the fields. Tonight the fog was thicker. The beam of Ethan's flashlight cut through it in a pale cone as he moved downhill through the trees. Ranger moved ahead of him without sound, gliding through the underbrush like a shadow. The Lawson property appeared slowly through the fog. The farmhouse looked smaller from this angle, its porch light glowing faintly above the steps. The barn stood dark behind it, the roofline crooked with age. Ethan stopped at the edge of the tree line. Ranger froze beside him, the dog's nose lowered to the ground. Then he moved. Slowly at first, circling near the fence line that bordered the pasture. His tail stiffened as he followed something invisible through the grass. Ethan crouched down beside the fence and ran his flashlight across the ground. Boot prints, fresh. The impressions cut sharply into the damp soil near the gate Margaret had noticed earlier. Someone had stepped through here recently, within the last day or two. Ranger let out a low rumble in his chest. Ethan studied the tracks for a moment longer before standing. "Well," he murmured softly, "looks like you weren't imagining things." He glanced toward the farmhouse. The kitchen light had gone out now. Ethan hesitated. Part of him considered turning back toward the cabin. This valley wasn't his responsibility. The woman down there had probably just arrived after years away. Maybe the tracks belonged to hunters or hikers passing through. But Ranger wasn't convinced. The dog had moved toward the smokehouse behind the farmhouse now, sniffing along the edge of the stone foundation. Then Ranger stopped completely. He stood motionless beside the wall, staring at the ground. Ethan frowned slightly. "What is it, boy?" Ranger didn't bark. He simply remained still, nose hovering inches above the dirt near the foundation stones. Ethan walked closer. The ground beside the smokehouse looked slightly disturbed, as if someone had knelt there recently. Not a large area, just enough to suggest someone had been searching or examining something. Ethan straightened slowly. Interesting. Behind him, the farmhouse door creaked open. Ethan turned. Margaret Lawson stepped out onto the porch, holding a lantern that cast warm light across the wooden boards. Her gray hair moved slightly in the breeze as she looked toward the yard. For a moment, she simply stared at the figure standing near the smokehouse. Ethan raised one hand calmly. "Evening," he called gently. Margaret blinked, clearly surprised. "Oh!" She stepped down from the porch, the lantern swinging slightly as she approached. "I didn't realize anyone else was out here." Ethan nodded politely. "My name's Ethan Cole. I live up on the ridge." He gestured toward the dark tree line above the valley. "Saw your car come in earlier." Margaret looked up toward the ridge, then back at him. "I suppose that makes you my neighbor?" "Closest one you've got for a few miles." Ranger trotted forward, stopping beside Ethan. Margaret's expression softened slightly as she noticed the dog. "Well," she said gently, "aren't you a handsome one?" Ranger watched her carefully, but did not move closer. "He's Ranger," Ethan said. "Retired military K-9. Margaret crouched slightly, holding out her hand. Ranger sniffed it once before stepping forward and allowing her to touch the side of his neck. "Smart eyes," she said quietly. "He usually is." Margaret glanced toward the smokehouse. "Were you looking for something?" Ethan shook his head. "Just taking a walk. Ranger noticed some fresh tracks by your fence." Margaret's brow furrowed slightly. "Tracks?" Ethan nodded toward the ground. Someone came through your pasture recently. She looked down, studying the soil in the lantern light. I thought the gate looked strange when I arrived, she admitted. Ethan watched her reaction carefully. She didn't appear frightened, more puzzled than anything. Could be nothing, he said. Hunters sometimes pass through the valley this time of year. Margaret nodded slowly. I suppose that makes sense. Ranger suddenly turned back toward the smokehouse wall. His ears lifted. Then he stepped forward and began sniffing along the stones again. Margaret watched him curiously. What does he hear? Ethan followed the dog's movement. He's not hearing anything, he said quietly. He's smelling something. Ranger's nose moved along the mortar between the stones. Then he stopped at a single spot near the base of the wall. He looked up at Ethan and scratched once at the ground. Margaret frowned slightly. Is that normal? Ethan crouched beside the dog. Not really. He ran his flashlight across the ground. Something small caught the light. A thin strip of bright orange plastic partially buried in the dirt. Ethan reached down and pulled it free. Survey tape, the kind used by land inspectors to mark property boundaries. Margaret stared at it. I've never seen that before. Ethan studied the tape silently. Then he looked out across the dark valley. Yeah, he said quietly. I figured. The fog thickened around the farmhouse as night settled over the mountains. And somewhere beyond the ridge road, far beyond Margaret's view, a second vehicle rolled slowly along the logging trail, its headlights dark as it moved through the trees. Ranger's head lifted again. He stared into the darkness. Waiting. Ranger did not move. The dog stood beside Ethan with his body angled toward the forest, ears forward, muscles held in that quiet tension that meant his attention was fixed somewhere far beyond what human eyes could see. Margaret noticed it too. The lantern in her hand flickered slightly in the night air as she followed the direction of Ranger's gaze. But the fog had grown thicker across the pasture, swallowing the tree line in soft, gray shadows. She saw nothing. After a long moment, Ranger's posture relaxed just enough for Ethan to exhale. Probably just deer moving through the trees, Ethan said. Margaret nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. The mountains carried sound differently at night. Sometimes the quiet itself could feel like something watching. She looked again at the thin strip of orange survey tape Ethan still held between his fingers. You said hunters sometimes come through, she said slowly. Would hunters use something like that? Ethan turned the plastic strip in the beam of his flashlight. Not usually. He tucked it into the pocket of his jacket. But people who measure land do. Margaret absorbed that in silence. The farmhouse loomed quietly behind them, its windows dark now except for the faint glow from the hallway lamp she had left on. Well, she said after a moment, forcing a gentle smile. It's my first night back. Maybe the mountains are just welcoming me in their own strange way. Ethan gave a small nod. Maybe. But Ranger was still watching the woods. After another minute, Ethan stepped back toward the pasture gate. You should get some rest, he said. If anything strange happens, my cabin's up on the ridge. Light in the window most nights. Margaret followed his gesture toward the dark slope above the valley. I appreciate that. She hesitated before adding quietly, and thank you for checking the property. Ethan shrugged lightly. Ranger gets curious. Ranger glanced back at them as if understanding his name. Margaret knelt once more and scratched the side of the dog's neck. You're a good guardian, aren't you? Ranger accepted the attention for exactly 2 seconds before stepping back beside Ethan again. Work first. Always. Ethan gave Margaret a brief nod before turning toward the tree line. Ranger fell into step beside him, silent as smoke as they disappeared back into the fog-covered woods. Margaret stood alone in the yard for another moment. The valley had gone completely still. Somewhere in the distance an owl called once, its voice echoing softly through the trees. She turned and walked slowly back to the porch. Inside, the house seemed larger now. The quiet rooms held the faint smell of old wood and dust stirred awake after years of stillness. Margaret carried the lantern through the hallway and set it on the kitchen table before opening the curtains above the sink. Outside, the pasture rolled away into darkness. She stared at it for a long time. 42 years of marriage had ended in a courthouse office that morning. Now she stood alone in the house where her life had begun, trying to understand what the next chapter was supposed to look like. Margaret turned away from the window and began unpacking the small box she had brought from Charleston. Inside were a few photographs, some clothes, and the leather folder that held the documents from the divorce. She slid the folder into a drawer without opening it. That life was finished. Tonight, she wanted only quiet. But sleep didn't come easily. Margaret lay awake for hours listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountains, wind moving through the trees, the creak of old boards settling beneath the night air. Once she thought she heard a vehicle far away on the ridge road, though the sound faded before she could be certain. Eventually, exhaustion pulled her into shallow sleep. Morning arrived wrapped in pale blue fog that drifted slowly across the valley. Margaret woke early. Habit from decades of routine still guided her body, even if the life that routine belonged to had disappeared. She stepped outside onto the porch with a cup of coffee and breathed in the cold mountain air. The view was beautiful. Sunlight spilled slowly over the eastern ridge, cutting through the fog in long golden beams. Birds moved through the orchard trees, and somewhere nearby water trickled through the creek bed that ran along the property line. It felt peaceful. Almost. Margaret walked toward the pasture gate again. The latch hung exactly where she had left it the night before. The boot prints Ethan had pointed out were still visible in the damp earth. She studied them more closely now. There were at least 2 different sets, both recent. Margaret straightened slowly. "All right," she murmured quietly to herself. "That's strange." She turned toward the barn. The structure stood weathered but sturdy beyond the pasture fence. Tall grass swayed around its base, and the roof shingles had faded into a dull gray. Margaret pushed open the gate and crossed the field. The barn door groaned as she slid it aside. Dust floated in the air as sunlight streamed through gaps in the wood planks. The interior smelled of old hay and rusted metal tools left exactly where her father had once used them. She walked slowly through the space. Everything looked untouched. But near the far wall, something caught her eye. A small stack of papers lay on an overturned crate beside the workbench. Margaret frowned. She stepped closer. The top sheet was printed with survey markings and property boundary diagrams. The date at the bottom was recent. Very recent. Her chest tightened slightly. Margaret flipped through the pages. Coordinates. Land measurements. Geological notes. All referencing the Lawson property. And on the final page, at the bottom corner, a name appeared in small typed letters. Daniel Lawson. Margaret stared at it for a long moment. The quiet of the barn seemed to grow heavier around her. Daniel had told her this land was worthless. Daniel had insisted the farmhouse wasn't worth repairing. Daniel had said the valley held nothing but old trees and empty fields. And yet someone had come here recently. Someone measuring the property. Someone working for him. Margaret closed the folder slowly. The first feeling that rose inside her was not sadness. It was something colder. Understanding. Above the valley, The trail that led down from the ridge shifted slightly as a large German shepherd appeared between the trees. Ranger moved quickly through the tall grass toward the barn. Behind him, Ethan followed at a steady pace. The dog reached the open doorway first. He stopped beside Margaret and lowered his nose to the stack of papers. Then he looked up at Ethan and gave one low, certain bark. Ethan stepped inside. "What did you find?" Margaret held up the documents. "I think," she said quietly, "my ex-husband lied to me about this land for a very long time." Ethan took the papers and scanned the first page. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Looks like someone's been surveying your property." Margaret met his gaze. "Yes." She pointed to the name at the bottom of the page. "And I think I know who sent them." Outside the barn, the morning fog began to lift slowly from the valley floor, revealing just how much land stretched beyond the farmhouse, and how many secrets it might be hiding. Morning light slowly filled the valley, dissolving the last thin ribbons of fog drifting between the hills. From the barn doorway, Margaret Lawson could see the full spread of the property her father had left her. Rolling pasture, the creek cutting silver through the grass, and the long tree line that climbed toward the ridge where Ethan Cole's cabin stood hidden among the pines. It was more land than she remembered, more land than Daniel had ever allowed her to think about. Ethan remained quiet beside the workbench, studying the survey papers in his hands. Ranger sat beside him, alert but calm, watching Margaret the way trained dogs watched people they had not yet decided whether to trust completely. Ethan turned the pages slowly. "These measurements are recent," he said. Margaret crossed her arms loosely. "How recent?" "Within a few weeks, maybe less." He flipped to another page where several boundary lines had been marked in red ink. Whoever ordered this was mapping the property carefully. Margaret stared out the barn door again. "My husband always said the land wasn't worth anything." Ethan glanced at her. "And you believed him?" She let out a small breath. "For 42 years. Ranger suddenly stood. His nose lifted into the air as he stepped toward the barn entrance, sniffing with slow, deliberate movements. Ethan noticed immediately. "What do you smell, boy?" Ranger moved outside, nose low now, tracing a path across the grass behind the barn. Ethan followed. Margaret hesitated before stepping out after them. The morning sun had warmed the ground enough to release the scent of damp soil and crushed weeds. Ranger moved through it carefully, weaving back and forth across a narrow path that curved toward the tree line behind the smokehouse. Then he stopped. The dog lowered his nose to the ground and began pawing gently at the dirt. Ethan crouched beside him. "What is it?" Ranger scratched again. The soil in that spot looked slightly darker, disturbed compared to the rest of the grass. Ethan brushed away the loose dirt with his hand. A faint indentation appeared. "Boot prints." Margaret's stomach tightened. "More tracks?" Ethan nodded. "Same as last night." He stood and scanned the surrounding area. "These head toward the ridge." Margaret followed the direction he pointed. The path disappeared into the woods behind the property where the land rose gradually toward the logging road that cut across the mountainside. "That road up there," she said slowly. "Does it go anywhere?" "Old timber trail," Ethan replied. "Mostly unused now." He paused. "But someone's been using it lately." Ranger moved again, following the scent trail deeper toward the trees. Ethan watched him carefully before speaking. "He's tracking something." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "You mean someone?" "Maybe." They followed Ranger toward the forest edge. Tall oaks and maple trees formed a thick wall of shade just beyond the pasture. The ground beneath them was layered with fallen leaves and broken branches that muffled their footsteps. Ranger moved steadily forward. Then he stopped again. This time he lowered his head beneath a cluster of low branches and pulled something free from the brush. A crumpled white cup. Fast food brand printed along the side. Ethan took it from Ranger and turned it in his hand. "Not old," he said. Margaret frowned. "How can you tell?" "Still smells like coffee." He held it up to the light. "From town. Gas station off Highway 219. Margaret recognized the logo immediately. "That's almost 30 miles away." "Exactly." Ranger sniffed the ground again, circling slowly as if mapping the movements of whoever had stood there. Ethan studied the area carefully. "2 men, at least," he murmured. Margaret looked at him. "How can you know that?" He pointed to 2 sets of impressions barely visible in the leaves. "One heavier, one lighter. Different stride lengths." Margaret stared at the forest around them. The quiet of the mountains suddenly felt less peaceful. "Why would anyone be out here?" she asked. Ethan glanced down at the survey papers still tucked beneath his arm. "Probably the same reason someone measured your land." They walked back toward the barn in silence. Margaret's thoughts raced now, assembling pieces she hadn't wanted to question before. Daniel had always controlled their finances. Daniel had always handled legal documents. Daniel had always insisted the farmhouse was too remote to maintain. And Daniel had always discouraged her from visiting the property. The realization settled slowly into her chest like a stone. "I need to call someone," she said finally. Ethan looked up. "A lawyer." Margaret reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. "There's an attorney in Charleston, Carolyn Pierce. She handled part of my divorce paperwork." Ethan nodded once. "Probably a good place to start." Margaret stepped outside the barn and dialed the number. The line rang twice before a woman answered. "Pierce Law Office." "Ms. Pierce, this is Margaret Lawson." A pause. "Mrs. Lawson, of course. Is everything all right?" Margaret looked down at the survey documents in her hand. "I believe my ex-husband may have been investigating property that legally belongs to me." Another pause, this one longer. "What kind of investigation?" Margaret inhaled slowly. "Land surveys, boundary markings, and possibly forged signatures." Caroline Pierce's voice sharpened immediately. "I'm going to need to see those documents. I can bring them to Charleston." "That would be best," the lawyer replied. "And Mrs. Lawson?" "Yes." "If what you're describing is accurate, you may be dealing with something far more serious than a simple property dispute." Margaret ended the call slowly. When she looked up, Ethan was watching her. "Well?" he asked. "She wants to see everything." Ethan nodded. "That's good." Ranger stepped beside him again, staring toward the ridge road high above the valley. The dog's ears rose. Ethan followed his gaze. In the distance, through a break in the trees, a dark truck rolled slowly along the logging road. It paused briefly, then continued out of sight. Ethan's expression hardened slightly. "Looks like someone's still interested in this place." Margaret folded the survey papers carefully. For the first time since arriving at the farmhouse, she felt something stronger than confusion. Resolve. "Then they picked the wrong time to start asking questions," she said quietly. Ranger stood beside Ethan, staring into the woods. The dog already knew what the valley was beginning to reveal. This land had not been forgotten. It had been watched. And now the people who wanted it were coming back. The thought stayed with Margaret Lawson long after Ethan and Ranger had returned to the ridge. The valley grew quiet again that afternoon, the way remote places often did after a disturbance. Wind moved slowly through the tall grass around the farmhouse, and the trees whispered softly along the hillsides. But the silence felt different now. Margaret sat at the kitchen table with the survey documents spread in front of her. Sunlight drifted through the window above the sink, casting pale rectangles across the worn wood floor. Her father had built that table himself. She ran her fingers slowly along the surface, remembering mornings when he used to sit here with a mug of coffee and the local paper, the radio humming softly beside him. He had always loved this land, every acre of it. Margaret looked down again at the papers. Coordinates. Measurements. Geological notes she didn't fully understand. But one thing was clear. Someone had invested time and money studying the property. Daniel had known something he had never told her. Margaret folded the documents carefully and placed them inside a manila folder before rising from the table. She stepped outside onto the porch, letting the cold mountain air clear her thoughts. Across the valley, the ridgeline stood sharp beneath the afternoon sky. Somewhere up there, Ethan Cole and Ranger were watching. The thought comforted her more than she expected. Margaret walked down from the porch and crossed the yard toward the smokehouse behind the farmhouse. The small stone building had been there longer than the house itself, its rough walls darkened by decades of weather. Her father had used it to cure meat when she was young. Later it became a place for tools and storage. She pushed open the wooden door. The smell of dust and old wood filled the air. Light slipped through the narrow window above the back wall, illuminating shelves lined with jars and rusted equipment. Margaret stepped inside slowly. Everything looked exactly as she remembered, except for one thing. Near the back corner of the room, the floorboards beneath the workbench looked slightly uneven. She frowned. Had that always been there? Margaret walked closer. The boards near the wall had been shifted just enough to create a faint gap between them. Not obvious unless someone was looking carefully. She crouched and ran her fingers along the edge of the wood. The board moved slightly. Margaret's pulse quickened. She looked around the small room, suddenly aware of how quiet the valley had become. Then she pulled the board upward. It lifted easily. Beneath it was a shallow space between the beams, and inside that space rested a small metal container wrapped in old oilcloth. Margaret stared at it for a long moment. The container was weathered but intact, the metal surface dark with age. Her father had hidden this here, carefully, deliberately. Margaret lifted the box and carried it to the workbench. Her hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped the cloth. The lid resisted at first, sealed tight after years of being untouched. Then it opened. Inside were several documents tied together with a thin leather cord. Margaret sat down on the wooden stool beside the bench and slowly untied it. The first page was a letter. Her father's handwriting filled the paper in neat, steady lines. Margaret, if you are reading this, then something has happened that forced you to return here. I hope it was not because someone tried to take this land from you. But if that has happened, then you must understand something. This land is not worthless. It never was. Margaret swallowed. She turned the page. The next documents were geological surveys dated more than 15 years earlier, technical reports stamped by a regional resource company. She skimmed through the pages until certain words repeated again and again. Mineral concentration, subsurface deposits, rare earth elements. Her breath caught in her throat. The final report summarized the findings in plain language. The lower fields of the Lawson property contained a mineral deposit significant enough to attract commercial development. Margaret leaned back slowly on the stool. Daniel had known. All those years he had insisted the land was worthless. All those years he discouraged her from coming back. He had known exactly what this place might hold. Her hands trembled as she returned to the letter. I suspected someone might try to buy this land cheaply if they discovered what was here, her father had written. That is why I placed everything in your name alone, And that is why I hid these records where only you would find them if you ever needed the truth." Margaret pressed the paper against the table. Outside, the wind shifted suddenly across the valley. Footsteps sounded in the grass. Ranger appeared in the doorway first. The German shepherd paused, nose lifting as he stepped inside the smokehouse. Behind him came Ethan. He took one look at the open floorboards and the documents spread across the workbench. "Looks like Ranger found something important," he said quietly. Margaret handed him the survey report without speaking. Ethan read the page slowly. Then he looked up at her. "This land's worth a lot more than anyone told you." Margaret nodded once. "My father knew." She handed him the letter. Ethan read it carefully, the lines of his face tightening as he reached the final paragraph. When he finished, he folded the paper gently and placed it back on the table. "Your ex-husband probably knew too." Margaret stared at the documents. "That's why he kept me away from here." Outside, Ranger suddenly turned toward the forest again. His ears rose. Low in his throat came the same warning rumble Margaret had heard the night before. Ethan stepped to the doorway. The ridge road was visible from here through a narrow break in the trees. A dark vehicle rolled slowly along the trail, stopping just long enough for someone inside to look down toward the farmhouse. Then it continued into the woods. Ethan's voice was calm when he spoke again. "They're not done yet." Margaret looked at the metal box resting open on the table. "No," she said quietly. "They're just getting started." The words hung in the air inside the smokehouse. For a moment, no one moved. The metal box sat open on the workbench between them, its contents spread across the rough wood surface. The letter from Margaret's father lay on top of the geological reports. The ink faded slightly with time, but still clear enough to read every careful line. Outside, the valley remained silent, but the silence no longer felt peaceful. Ethan stepped back from the doorway and closed the smokehouse door gently. Ranger followed him inside, the dog's head turning slowly as he checked each corner of the small room. When Ranger finally settled near the door, Ethan returned to the workbench. "Let's take another look at this," he said quietly. Margaret nodded. Her hands were steady now as she picked up the letter again. The first time she read it, the shock had rushed through her too quickly for the details to settle. Now she forced herself to read every line carefully. Her father's handwriting was unmistakable. "Margaret, if you are reading this, then it means you came back to the land. I hoped you would one day, though I was never certain what would bring you home. I want you to understand something very clearly. If anyone ever tells you this land is worthless, they are lying." She paused. Her father had always been a careful man with words. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't make dramatic claims. If he had written something like this, he had meant every word. Margaret continued reading. "I discovered the truth about this property 15 years ago when a company approached me asking questions about the mineral layers beneath the valley. They believed the land contained something rare. I did not trust their intentions, so I hired my own survey team." Ethan leaned closer to the table. Margaret slid the geological report toward him. The numbers on the page meant little to her, but Ethan studied them with quiet concentration. "These are legitimate surveys," he said. "Professional work." Margaret turned the page of the letter. The reports confirmed what those men suspected. The lower fields of this land contain deposits valuable enough that people may try to acquire it quietly. That is why I changed the will and placed everything in your name alone." Margaret's throat tightened. She could almost hear her father's voice as she read. He had never explained that change when he was alive. At the time, she assumed it was simply his way of simplifying the inheritance. Now she understood. Her father had been protecting her. Margaret read the final paragraph. "If someone tries to take this land from you, Remember that it belongs to you for a reason. This valley has always taken care of the Lawson family. Trust your instincts, and do not let anyone convince you that what you have here is small." She lowered the paper slowly. For several seconds, neither she nor Ethan spoke. The weight of the discovery settled quietly between them. Ranger lifted his head slightly, watching both of them with patient focus. Ethan finally broke the silence. "Your father knew exactly what he was doing." Margaret nodded. "He must have suspected someone would try to buy the property cheaply. Or steal it another way," Ethan said. Margaret looked up. "You think Daniel knew about this too?" Ethan tapped one of the survey reports. "These documents are 15 years old." Margaret felt a cold realization settle over her. 15 years ago," she said slowly, "Daniel suddenly started talking about selling the farmhouse." She remembered those conversations now with painful clarity. The way he insisted the place was too far away, too expensive to repair, too isolated to maintain. She had believed him, because she had trusted him. Ethan studied the ridge road again through the small window. "If your husband knew about these deposits," he said quietly, "that would explain the surveys someone ran on the property recently." Margaret's jaw tightened. "He spent years telling me this land was worthless." Ethan met her eyes. "Sometimes people hide the truth when they're waiting for the right moment to take something." Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the metal box. For a long moment, she simply stared at the documents. "So what happens now?" she asked. Ethan leaned against the wall, arms folded loosely. "You said your lawyer wanted to see everything." "Yes, Caroline Pierce." "Good," Ethan said. "Let her handle the legal side." Margaret nodded slowly. "And the other side?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Ranger suddenly stood and moved toward the door again, nose lifted toward the outside air. The dog sniffed once, then again. His posture stiffened. Ethan noticed instantly. "What is it?" Ranger gave a low, warning growl. Margaret looked toward the window. "What does he hear?" Ethan stepped outside. The afternoon sun had begun lowering toward the western ridge, casting long shadows across the pasture. The valley looked peaceful, but Ethan's eyes moved carefully across the tree line. A flash of movement caught his attention. Far up the ridge road, partially hidden behind a stand of pines, a dark truck sat parked along the old logging trail. Its engine was off, but someone was inside, watching. Ethan stood perfectly still. Ranger stepped beside him, his body angled toward the vehicle. Margaret came to the doorway. "What is it?" Ethan didn't take his eyes off the ridge. "You have company." Margaret followed his gaze. The truck was barely visible from this distance, but once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. A black shape against the trees, waiting. "Are they coming down here?" she asked quietly. Ethan shook his head. "Not today." The truck remained parked for another minute. Then the engine started. The vehicle turned slowly and disappeared back along the ridge road, swallowed by the trees. Ranger's growl faded. Ethan watched the road for several seconds longer before speaking. "They wanted to see if you found anything." Margaret looked down at the metal box still resting on the workbench. "Well," she said quietly, "now they know." The valley fell silent again as the sun sank lower behind the mountains. But this time the silence felt like the calm before something larger. And somewhere far beyond the ridge road, a man named Daniel Lawson was about to learn that the land he had been quietly planning to take for 15 years was no longer unguarded. The evening settled slowly across the valley. The sky turned the color of fading copper behind the mountains, and long shadows stretched across the fields around the farmhouse. Margaret closed the smokehouse door behind her and carried the metal box back toward the house with careful hands. Ethan walked beside her, while Ranger moved a few steps ahead, scanning the property with calm vigilance. "Do you always patrol like that?" Margaret asked softly. Ethan gave a faint smile. "Old habits?" They reached the porch. Margaret paused before stepping inside and looked once more toward the ridge road where the truck had disappeared. "You think they'll come back tonight?" "Not tonight," Ethan said. He leaned lightly against the porch railing, his eyes moving across the land as if measuring every shadow. "They were checking something." "What?" "If you found what they were looking for." Margaret glanced down at the metal box. "I think they already know the answer." Inside the house, the kitchen light warmed the quiet room as Margaret set the documents on the table again. She carefully organized the survey reports, her father's letter, and the notes that explained the mineral deposits beneath the valley. Ethan remained standing by the window. Ranger lay on the floor nearby, but the dog's head remained lifted, ears alert to every sound outside. Margaret dialed her lawyer's number again. Carolyn Pierce answered almost immediately. "Mrs. Lawson?" "I found something," Margaret said. There was a pause on the line. "What kind of something?" Margaret glanced at Ethan. "My father left documents hidden on the property, geological surveys, evidence that the land may contain valuable mineral deposits." Another pause. Then Caroline's voice grew sharper. "Did anyone else know about these documents?" Margaret exhaled slowly. "I believe my ex-husband did." "Then you need to listen carefully," Carolyn said. Margaret straightened slightly. If Mr. Lawson knew the land had value, and he attempted to obtain it through deception or forged documents, that could qualify as fraud. Margaret felt something tighten inside her chest. "There were forged signatures on the survey request we found." Carolyn spoke again, slower this time. "Mrs. Lawson, do you know the name Tyler Grant?" Margaret frowned. "No." "He's a land broker. He's been involved in several aggressive property acquisitions across the state." Margaret's fingers tightened around the phone. "Why are you asking?" "Because his name appears in a set of legal filings connected to your husband's company." Ethan turned slightly at that. Margaret's voice dropped. "What kind of filings?" "Preliminary acquisition agreements." Silence filled the kitchen. Margaret slowly sat down. "You're telling me Daniel had already started preparing to buy the land?" Caroline answered quietly. "Yes." "But that's impossible," Margaret said. "The property is legally mine." "Exactly," Caroline replied. "And that means the only way he could secure the land would be to pressure you into selling it." Margaret closed her eyes. "Or convince me it wasn't worth anything." "Which it clearly is," Caroline said. Margaret nodded slowly. "And if he believed I would return here after the divorce," Ethan finished the thought. "Then he was waiting." Margaret ended the call and set the phone on the table. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she looked at Ethan. "He expected me to come back." Ethan nodded. "Probably figured you'd feel isolated out here. And vulnerable." Ethan didn't argue. Margaret stood and walked to the window. The valley stretched before her in the fading light, peaceful and quiet. But now she could see the shape of something beneath that calm. Daniel had been preparing this for years. Every suggestion that the land was worthless, every argument about selling it, every reason she had stayed away. It had all been part of the same quiet plan. Margaret turned back toward the table. "So what happens next?" Ethan looked toward Ranger. The dog was already watching the door. "Next," Ethan said calmly, "we make sure they understand something. Margaret raised an eyebrow. What's that? That you're not alone here. Outside, the last light of day slipped behind the mountains. Night arrived quickly in the valley, and far away along the highway leading into the mountains, a dark SUV turned off the main road and began climbing toward the logging trail. Inside the vehicle, Tyler Grant glanced toward the driver. You sure she found it? The driver kept his eyes on the road. If she didn't, she will soon. Tyler leaned back in his seat. And if she refuses to sell? The driver's expression remained cold. Then we convince her. Back at the farmhouse, Ranger suddenly stood. His ears lifted. Ethan noticed instantly. What is it? Ranger walked slowly toward the front door and stared into the darkness beyond the porch. The valley had gone silent again. But this time the silence carried something new. Movement. Ethan stepped beside the dog. What do you hear? Ranger's low growl answered before Ethan's eyes could confirm it. Far up the ridge road, headlights flickered briefly through the trees. Someone was coming back. And this time they weren't just watching. The headlights moved slowly through the trees along the ridge road, flickering between trunks like distant lightning. Ranger's growl deepened in his chest, low and controlled, the sound of a trained dog signaling danger rather than panic. Ethan stood beside the front window of the farmhouse, his body suddenly very still. Years ago, in another country, in another life, he had learned the value of silence before action. The habit returned now without effort, the way old scars sometimes ached before a storm. How far away? Margaret asked quietly behind him. Ethan studied the shifting lights. Still up on the logging road. The beams disappeared again as the vehicle slowed near the tree line. Ranger stepped closer to the door. Every muscle in the dog's body tightened. Margaret felt a chill run along her spine. They're coming here. Ethan nodded once. Looks like it. He reached for the porch light switch and turned it off. The house fell into darkness except for the faint glow from the kitchen lamp behind them. Why turn off the lights? Margaret asked. So they can't see inside. Ethan moved calmly through the room, checking the back door and windows with quiet efficiency. The movements were instinctive, habits built during years when darkness and uncertainty had meant survival. Margaret watched him. There was something unsettling about the way he shifted when danger appeared. The calm neighbor she had met earlier had vanished. In his place stood someone sharper, quieter, every sense alert. Ranger let out another low growl. The headlights appeared again, closer now. Then the engine cut. The valley went completely silent. Ethan opened the front door slowly. Cool night air drifted into the house. Stay inside, he said quietly. Margaret stepped forward. I'm not hiding. Ethan met her eyes. I didn't ask you to hide. Ranger slipped through the doorway first. The dog moved down the porch steps and into the grass with silent purpose, nose lifted to catch the scent drifting from the forest. Ethan followed. Margaret stood in the doorway, gripping the edge of the frame as she watched them disappear into the darkness toward the barn. The woods beyond the pasture were thick and shadowed. Ethan walked slowly, letting Ranger lead. The dog moved in careful arcs through the tall grass, following something invisible to human senses. Then Ranger stopped. His head snapped toward the tree line. A branch cracked somewhere in the woods. Ethan crouched instantly. The sound of movement followed, someone stepping through leaves. Then another step. 2 men emerged from the shadows. They wore dark jackets and carried flashlights pointed toward the ground. One of them held a folded map. Neither man noticed Ethan at first. They were focused on the smokehouse. Boss said it's near here, the taller one muttered. The second man nodded. Survey markers said the structure was close to the mineral layer. Ethan's jaw tightened. They knew exactly where they were. Ranger's muscles tensed beside him. Ethan whispered quietly, "Easy." The dog waited. The two men moved closer to the smokehouse door. One of them pulled a crowbar from his backpack. Margaret watched from the farmhouse porch as the figures moved through the dark field. Her heart pounded. "Ethan?" she called softly. The taller intruder froze. He turned toward the sound of her voice. "What the—" Ethan stood up. "Evening." The men spun around. For a second, everyone stared at one another across the grass. Then the man with the crowbar swore. "Let's go." They turned and ran toward the forest. Ranger launched forward instantly. The German shepherd covered the distance in seconds, his powerful stride cutting through the field like a shadow. "Ranger!" Ethan shouted. The dog was already in the trees. A scuffle erupted in the darkness. Branches snapped. One of the men shouted in panic. Then came a sharp crack. A gunshot. Margaret gasped. Ethan ran. He reached the edge of the forest just as Ranger burst from the brush, limping slightly, but still moving, driving one of the intruders ahead of him toward the pasture. The man stumbled, dropping his flashlight as he ran. The second intruder disappeared deeper into the woods. "Get in the truck!" someone shouted from the ridge road. Headlights flared suddenly above the tree line. The wounded man scrambled toward the forest again and vanished. Within seconds, the vehicle roared to life. Tires spun against gravel as the truck sped away into the mountains. Silence returned almost instantly. Ethan stood breathing hard at the edge of the trees. "Ranger!" The dog limped back toward him. Ethan knelt immediately. A thin line of blood ran along the dog's shoulder where the bullet had grazed his fur. Margaret hurried across the field. "Oh my God!" Ethan ran his hands gently along Ranger's side. "It's just a graze." Ranger leaned against him, breathing steadily despite the pain. The dog's eyes never left the forest. Margaret knelt beside them. "Is he going to be all right?" Ethan nodded. "He's tougher than both of us." Still, his hands trembled slightly as he checked the wound. For a moment, Margaret noticed something else in his eyes. Not fear, memory. A flash of something darker that belonged to another place and time. The same look soldiers carried when old battles returned without warning. Ranger pressed his head lightly against Ethan's arm. The contact steadied him. Ethan exhaled slowly. "We need to clean that." They walked back toward the farmhouse together. Inside the kitchen, Margaret found bandages while Ethan carefully cleaned the shallow wound. Ranger lay patiently on the floor, barely flinching as the antiseptic touched his fur. "You saved him," Margaret said quietly. Ethan shook his head. "He saved us." Outside, the mountains had returned to silence. But now the valley felt different. No longer just a quiet place hidden between ridges. Now it felt like contested ground. Margaret looked out the dark kitchen window toward the forest. "They'll come back again," she said. Ethan finished tying the bandage around Ranger's shoulder. "Probably." Ranger lifted his head. His eyes were calm again. Watching, waiting, and ready. The farmhouse kitchen was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock above the stove. Ranger lay on the floor beside Ethan's chair, his head resting on his paws, the fresh bandage wrapped neatly around his shoulder. The dog's breathing was steady now, though every so often his ears twitched toward the windows, still listening for sounds beyond the walls. Ethan sat beside him, one hand resting lightly on Ranger's neck. The contact grounded him. It had always been that way. Margaret moved quietly around the kitchen, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. The smell filled the room, warm and comforting against the tension that lingered from the night's confrontation. She placed 1 mug beside Ethan. "Thank you," she said. Ethan nodded. Neither of them mentioned the gunshot again, but the memory of it hung between them like the echo of thunder long after the storm had passed. Margaret sat across from him at the table. "Do you think they'll come back tonight?" Ethan took a slow sip of coffee. "No." She studied him. "You sound sure." "They got what they came for." Margaret frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Ethan leaned back in the chair. "They wanted to see what you'd found." Margaret's eyes drifted toward the metal box sitting on the counter. "They know now." Ethan nodded. "And they know they're not the only ones watching the property anymore." Margaret exhaled slowly. The weight of that reality settled over her. "What happens next?" Ethan looked down at Ranger. The dog lifted his head slightly, meeting his eyes. "Next," Ethan said quietly, "we make sure they understand something." Margaret waited. That this valley isn't as empty as they thought. Morning arrived slowly. The sun climbed above the eastern ridge and spilled pale gold across the fields. The valley looked peaceful again, as if the events of the night before had been nothing more than a passing disturbance. But the tire tracks along the pasture gate told a different story. Ethan stood outside near the barn, studying the ground. Ranger walked beside him carefully, favoring his injured shoulder, but refusing to stay inside. Margaret joined them a few minutes later. "You should be resting," she told the dog gently. Ranger ignored her completely. Ethan allowed himself a faint smile. "He's stubborn." Margaret knelt and scratched behind the dog's ear. "Sounds familiar." Ethan stood and wiped the dirt from his hands. "I called someone this morning." Margaret looked up. "Who?" "Sheriff Logan Reed." Margaret nodded slowly. "I remember that name." "Good man," Ethan said. "Runs the county office in town." "And he believes you?" Ethan shrugged slightly. "He believes Ranger." Margaret followed Ethan's gaze. Ranger had stopped near the tree line again, staring into the woods where the intruders had vanished the night before. "He remembers the scent," Ethan explained. Margaret felt a strange comfort hearing that. The dog would not forget. An hour later, a pickup truck rolled down the gravel road toward the farmhouse. The county sheriff stepped out first. Logan Reed was a tall man in his early 50s with silver hair and the calm expression of someone who had spent decades handling other people's problems. He walked toward Ethan and Margaret with an easy stride. "Morning, Cole." Ethan nodded. "Sheriff?" Logan crouched beside Ranger, studying the bandage on the dog's shoulder. "Heard he took a hit last night." "Just a graze." Logan rubbed the dog's neck. "Still tougher than most deputies I know." Ranger accepted the compliment with quiet dignity. Logan stood and looked across the valley. "Two men broke onto the property?" Ethan nodded. "Looking for something in the smokehouse." Margaret stepped forward. "They were searching for documents." Logan's eyes sharpened slightly. "What kind of documents?" Margaret handed him the folder. Logan flipped through the survey reports slowly. "Mineral deposits," he muttered. Then he looked up at Margaret. "You realize what this means, Mrs. Lawson?" Margaret nodded. "It means my ex-husband has been lying to me for years." Logan closed the folder. "It means someone believes this land is worth a lot of money." Margaret's expression hardened slightly. "I believe that too now." Logan glanced at Ethan. "You think those men were connected to Lawson?" Ethan shrugged. "They knew exactly where to search." Logan sighed. "Well, I'll have patrols drive through the Ridge Road more often." He looked at Margaret again. "But if someone's serious about this land, they're not going to stop with one visit." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "I didn't expect them to." Logan studied her for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "You've got a good neighbor here," he said, gesturing toward Ethan. Margaret glanced at Ethan. "Yes," she said quietly. "I do." Logan climbed back into his truck. "I'll be in touch," he said before driving away. The valley grew quiet again. Margaret watched the sheriff's truck disappear down the road. "Do you ever get used to this?" she asked. Ethan looked toward the forest. "To what?" "Waiting for trouble." He considered the question. "No." Ranger stepped beside him again, his tail brushing lightly against Ethan's leg. Ethan reached down and scratched the dog's neck. "But you learn how to live with it." Margaret looked out across the fields. The mountains stood silent and beautiful beneath the clear sky. But somewhere beyond those ridges, men were already planning their next move. And this time they would come prepared. Ethan felt the shift in the air before anything moved. Old instincts. The kind that never truly faded. He glanced toward Ranger. The dog was already watching the ridge again. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Looks like we're not finished yet." The valley had settled into one of those strange, quiet afternoons that followed a storm. Sunlight spilled across the fields as if nothing had happened the night before. But the stillness felt thin now, like glass stretched too tightly over something waiting beneath. Margaret stood beside the porch railing, watching the distant ridge. "How can you tell?" she asked. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Ranger had already moved several steps into the yard, his body angled toward the tree line again. The dog's nose lifted to the breeze, catching scents drifting down from the higher road. "Because Ranger hasn't relaxed," Ethan said quietly. Margaret followed the dog with her eyes. Ranger had stopped near the pasture gate, staring up toward the logging trail where the intruders had escaped the night before. The dog's posture was rigid, waiting. The day passed slowly. Margaret spent the afternoon organizing the documents inside the farmhouse, scanning each page and sending copies to Carolyn Pierce in Charleston. Her lawyer called twice with new questions, her voice growing more serious with each conversation. "Margaret," Caroline said during the second call, "I ran a background search on the broker we discussed, Tyler Grant." Margaret sat at the kitchen table, Ethan nearby reviewing the old survey maps. "And?" "He's connected to at least 3 disputed land acquisitions in the last decade, all involving mineral rights." Margaret's hand tightened around the phone. "Did any of those cases involve Daniel?" "Indirectly," Caroline replied. "But the pattern is clear. Your ex-husband likely intended to acquire your land through one of Grant's companies." Margaret glanced toward the window where Ethan stood looking across the valley. "So the divorce didn't stop him?" "No," Caroline said quietly. "If anything, it may have accelerated his plan." Margaret hung up slowly. Outside, the sky had begun to darken as clouds gathered over the mountains. Storm clouds. Ethan noticed them first. "Rain's coming," he said. Ranger walked toward him, the dog's tail stiff. Margaret stepped onto the porch again. The air had changed. Wind swept across the pasture, bending the tall grass in long waves. Thunder rolled faintly somewhere beyond the western ridge. But beneath the storm, another sound drifted faintly through the trees. An engine. Ethan heard it too. His head turned slowly toward the ridge road. Ranger's ears rose instantly. The dog stepped forward and let out a low, warning growl. Headlights flickered briefly through the trees above the valley. This time they didn't disappear. "They're coming down," Margaret whispered. Ethan moved quickly now. "Inside," he said calmly. Margaret hesitated. "You're not staying out here alone." "I'm not alone." He nodded toward Ranger. The dog stood ready beside him. Margaret nodded once and stepped back inside the farmhouse, closing the door but leaving the curtain slightly open so she could see the yard. Outside, Ethan moved toward the barn. The truck appeared moments later, descending slowly along the narrow logging road before turning toward the pasture gate. It stopped 20 yards from the fence. 3 men stepped out. Even from a distance, Ethan recognized one of them, Tyler Grant. The broker walked confidently toward the gate, his coat collar raised against the wind. The second man carried a flashlight. The third kept his hands in his pockets, watching the farmhouse windows. Grant spoke first. "You're persistent," he called across the field. Ethan stepped into the open. "I could say the same thing." Grant studied him carefully. "You must be the neighbor." Ethan didn't respond. Grant smiled thinly. "We're here to collect something that belongs to our client." "Doesn't look like your land." Grant's expression hardened. "The documents hidden in that building belong to Daniel Lawson." Inside the farmhouse, Margaret's heart pounded as she listened through the open window. Ethan's voice remained calm. "You should leave." Grant shook his head slowly. "That's not happening." The man beside him pulled a crowbar from the truck bed. Ranger stepped forward immediately. His growl cut through the rising wind. Grant noticed the dog. "A military shepherd," he said with mild interest. Ethan's tone remained even. "Last warning." Grant gave a small shrug. "Go ahead." The man with the crowbar started toward the smokehouse. Ranger moved before Ethan could speak. The dog launched across the field with explosive speed. "Ranger!" The command came a fraction too late. Ranger reached the man first. The intruder raised the crowbar defensively, but lost his balance as the dog slammed into him, sending both crashing into the grass. The second man reached for something inside his jacket. Ethan moved instantly. Years of training took over in one seamless motion. He closed the distance in seconds, knocking the man's arm aside before the weapon could clear the pocket. The man stumbled backward. Inside the farmhouse, Margaret heard the struggle and ran for the door. Outside, Ranger held the first intruder pinned to the ground, teeth bared inches from the man's throat. Grant stepped back slowly, raising his hands. "Easy," he muttered. Sirens echoed faintly from the distant road. Sheriff Logan Reed's patrol truck appeared seconds later, lights flashing as it tore down the gravel path. The intruders froze. Logan stepped out of the truck with 2 deputies behind him. "Hands where I can see them," he ordered. The confrontation ended as quickly as it began. Grant was handcuffed beside the truck. The other 2 men sat on the ground under the watchful eyes of the deputies. Ranger finally stepped back from the man he had pinned. The dog returned to Ethan's side, breathing hard but standing tall. Margaret reached them moments later. Her hands trembled slightly as she knelt beside the dog. "You did good," she whispered. Ranger leaned gently against her shoulder. Logan approached Ethan. "Looks like you handled things until we got here." Ethan nodded. Logan glanced toward the smokehouse. "What were they after?" Margaret answered before Ethan could speak. "Proof." Logan studied her face for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Well," he said, glancing at the deputies loading the men into the truck, "looks like they just gave us a lot of it." Thunder rolled across the valley as the storm finally broke overhead. Rain began falling in heavy sheets. Margaret stood beside Ethan and Ranger beneath the farmhouse porch as the sheriff's vehicle carried the intruders away. The valley looked different now, not quiet, not peaceful, but protected. And for the first time since arriving, Margaret felt something stronger than fear. Victory. The rain continued through most of the night. Heavy drops struck the farmhouse roof and rolled down the gutters in steady streams. Lightning flashed occasionally behind the mountains, lighting the valley in brief silver glimpses before darkness returned. Inside the farmhouse, the kitchen lamp burned late. Margaret sat at the table with the metal box and its documents spread before her once again. Every page had been copied, scanned, and carefully organized into folders that Carolyn Pierce now possessed in Charleston. Across from her, Ethan leaned back in his chair. Ranger slept near his boots, his injured shoulder resting comfortably against the wooden floor. The dog had not left Ethan's side since the confrontation with Tyler Grant and the other men. Margaret looked at them both. "I keep thinking about something," she said quietly. Ethan glanced up. "What's that?" "If my father knew about the land, and Daniel knew about the land, then this wasn't something that happened recently." Ethan nodded. "No." Margaret's eyes moved across the papers. "This has been building for years." Ethan didn't answer. He understood that kind of patience. Some battles took years before anyone realized they had begun. The phone rang just after midnight. Margaret answered immediately. "Margaret Lawson." "Mrs. Lawson, this is Sheriff Reed." His voice sounded calm but focused. "We finished questioning the men we picked up tonight." Margaret glanced at Ethan. "And?" "Tyler Grant was carrying several documents in his truck." Margaret felt her heart quicken. "What kind of documents?" "Preliminary purchase contracts," Logan said, "prepared under the assumption that your land would soon be available for sale." Margaret's expression hardened. "It isn't." Logan gave a quiet chuckle. "That much became clear tonight." He paused. "But there's something else." Margaret waited. The contracts were prepared by a company connected directly to Daniel Lawson. The room fell silent. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Margaret's voice remained steady. "So he really was behind all of it?" "Yes," Logan said. "And after tonight, we also have evidence that his associates attempted to enter your property illegally." Margaret exhaled slowly. "What happens now?" Logan answered without hesitation. "Now we build a case." Morning arrived clear and bright. The storm had washed the valley clean. Sunlight reflected from the wet grass and the leaves along the forest edge. Mist drifted lazily above the creek, as if the mountains themselves were slowly waking. Margaret stood on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the valley breathe again. Behind her, Ethan stepped outside. Ranger followed, moving carefully but confidently despite the healing wound. "Sheriff called this morning," Margaret said. Ethan nodded. "Good news?" "Yes." She turned toward him. "Daniel Lawson is officially under investigation." Ethan leaned against the porch railing. "For fraud?" "And conspiracy to illegally acquire property." Ethan glanced out across the pasture. "That'll slow him down." Margaret smiled faintly. "That's the idea." 2 weeks later, the courthouse in Charleston was filled with quiet voices and the echo of footsteps on polished floors. Margaret sat beside Carolyn Pierce at the front of the courtroom. Across the room, Daniel Lawson sat with his own attorneys. For the first time in years, Margaret studied him without the filters of marriage or memory. He looked smaller now, not physically, but something about his confidence had faded. The judge reviewed the evidence carefully. Survey records, forgery reports, property filings connected to Tyler Grant's company, and finally, the hidden documents from Margaret's father that proved the land had always been intended solely for her. Daniel Lawson said very little during the hearing, but his silence spoke clearly enough. The judge closed the case with calm authority. "The property known as the Lawson Farm remains under the sole legal ownership of Margaret Lawson," he ruled. Margaret felt something inside her chest release for the first time in decades. Daniel did not look at her as he left the courtroom. Outside the building, the city noise felt overwhelming after the quiet of the mountains. Ethan waited near the courthouse steps. Ranger lay beside him in the shade, watching the crowds with patient curiosity. Margaret walked toward them. "Well?" Ethan asked. She smiled. It's over. Ranger stood immediately and wagged his tail once. Ethan gave a small nod. Good. Margaret looked at him carefully. You didn't have to come all the way here. Ethan shrugged. Figured someone should make sure you got home safe. Margaret glanced down at Ranger. And him? Ethan looked at the dog. He insists. Ranger's tail moved again. Margaret laughed softly. As they walked down the courthouse steps together, Margaret felt something else settling into place. For years, she had believed the farmhouse was a symbol of everything she had lost. Now she understood it had always been something else, a beginning, and waiting for them. In the Appalachian Valley was a place where the past no longer controlled the future. Autumn arrived quietly in the mountains. The fields surrounding the farmhouse turned shades of gold and copper as the trees along the ridges blazed with color. Cold mornings filled the valley with drifting mist that slowly burned away as the sun clouded over the eastern hills. Margaret Lawson stood on the porch, wrapped in a wool sweater, watching the sunrise spread across the pasture. 3 months had passed since the court ruling. The valley had returned to its natural rhythm. Repairs had been made to the old farmhouse roof. The garden beds beside the barn had been cleared and replanted. Fresh white paint now framed the windows her father had installed decades earlier. The house felt alive again. Margaret stepped down from the porch and walked slowly across the damp grass toward the fence line. Beyond the pasture, Ranger ran through the field with powerful strides, his thick coat glowing in the morning light. The scar along his shoulder remained visible beneath the fur, but it no longer slowed him. The dog moved with the quiet confidence of an animal who understood exactly where he belonged. Ethan stood near the barn watching him. He held a wooden fence post steady while adjusting a new wire line that stretched along the property boundary. Margaret approached with a small smile. "You're rebuilding half the valley," she said. Ethan tightened the wire and stepped back. "Just fixing things that should have been fixed years ago." Ranger trotted toward them and stopped beside Ethan, panting happily. Margaret knelt and ran her hand along the dog's neck. "You look stronger every day," she said softly. Ranger leaned against her shoulder for a moment before turning his attention back toward the open fields. Ethan watched the horizon. The mountains looked peaceful that morning. Not empty, but calm. "You heard from your lawyer recently?" he asked. Margaret nodded. "Carolyn finalized the mineral licensing agreement last week." Ethan glanced at her. "That was quick." Margaret smiled faintly. "We made sure the contracts protect the land. No large operations. No damage to the valley." She looked across the pasture. "My father would have wanted that." Ethan nodded slowly. "And the rest?" "The royalties will keep the farm running for generations." Ethan leaned against the fence post. "Sounds like he planned well." Margaret looked down the valley toward the smokehouse and the farmhouse beyond it. "He believed this place would take care of us." Ranger suddenly lifted his head. A truck approached slowly along the gravel road. Margaret shaded her eyes as the vehicle rolled to a stop near the gate. Sheriff Logan Reed stepped out. "Morning," he called. Ethan waved. Logan walked across the field with relaxed steps. "Thought I'd check in," he said. Margaret greeted him with a warm smile. "You're always welcome here." Logan looked around the property. "Looks like the valley's doing all right." "It is," Margaret said. Logan scratched Ranger behind the ears. "And how's our local hero?" Ranger wagged his tail once. "He's officially retired now," Ethan said. Logan chuckled. "After the work he did around here, I'd say he earned it." They stood quietly for a moment, watching the sun climb higher above the ridges. The valley stretched out beneath the clear sky, fields, trees, and the winding road that disappeared into the forest. Logan finally turned back toward his truck. "Well," he said, "seems like everything turned out the way it should." Margaret watched him drive away. Ethan leaned on the fence beside her. "You ever regret coming back?" he asked. Margaret thought about the long years she had spent believing the farmhouse was only a reminder of everything she had lost. Then she looked at the valley again. The quiet fields, the mountains rising around them, the man and the dog who had helped protect the place when she needed it most. "No," she said softly. Ranger trotted ahead toward the ridge where the morning light spread across the grass. Ethan followed. Margaret walked beside them. At the top of the hill, they stopped. The entire valley opened beneath them. Sunlight poured across the land her father had trusted her to protect. For the first time in decades, Margaret Lawson felt completely at peace. She had come back to the farmhouse believing she was escaping a life built on quiet betrayal. But the valley had given her something else instead. A future. Beside her stood the two guardians who had helped make that future possible. A soldier who had once carried the weight of distant wars, and the loyal dog who had never left his side. Together they watched the sun rise over the Appalachian mountains, and the valley that had waited so many years finally felt like home again. If you believe a person should never give up the land and life that belong to them, type yes in the comments. Sometimes justice takes years, but standing your ground is always worth it. And if stories like this remind you what loyalty, courage, and home really mean, consider subscribing and joining us for the next story from the mountains.